Translating a recent scientific discovery about COVID-19 into a successful, safe therapeutic. Dr. Patterson is the CEO and founder of InCellDx Inc., a growth stage company that has translated research discoveries into state-of-the-art single-cell diagnostics in cancer, immuno-oncology, and infectious diseases.
Well, hello, everybody who's listening virtually. My name is Bruce Patterson, and I'm a virologist. You probably haven't heard of virologists in the past, but all of a sudden now, I think we're in the middle of an era where we need virologists. You're going to see me smile and be relatively hopeful because I am hopeful. The other thing is we've already saved lives with the approach that I'm going to talk about, and we're hoping to save even more lives as we go through FDA clinical trials with an exciting new drug that we developed based on a discovery that I'll talk about shortly. Now, everybody's heard about COVID. There's so much information out in the media and in the world about how it works and how infectious it is. And I hope to at least address some of those issues. I came back from China in January, talking to a company over there about doing a deal. When I first heard about this virus that was emerging, and it brings up a very interesting word that we're hearing a lot about, which is emerging infections. And what does emerging infections mean? It means they're infections that our bodies haven't seen before. So that's a very interesting conundrum for the human body because we basically have a storage vault of immune responses against pathogens, bugs, bacteria, viruses, parasites that the body uses when you're infected with those particular pathogens again. Emerging infections are something that our body has never seen before. But the body actually has some very elegant ways, rudimentary ways although, that, to fight off these emerging infections. And that's part of what I'm going to talk about because that's part of what happens in COVID. Okay, so where do we do all this work? Well, my company InCellDx specializes in developing novel approaches to both diagnosing particular pathogens, looking at how the pathogens work, working with companies that have therapeutics that can potentially work for these pathogens, and then most importantly, using the diagnostics to say that the therapeutic is actually working. So we've all heard about the different diagnostics and the shortage of diagnostics that are out there in the world. And those really revolve around, do you have the virus? Yes or no? That was the first wave of diagnostics. The second wave of diagnostics was, have you been exposed to the virus? And do you have immunity to the virus? Now, those are two very different questions. But the third level of diagnostics that we started thinking about over 2 months ago was, how can we design diagnostics and laboratory tests that say whatever we try on a patient is actually working? And that's the whole area of personalized medicine that we're in these days. And usually we apply that to cancer, but the fact is personalized medicine can also be applied to infectious disease. And that keeps patients from having to take one drug or another drug and act as a guinea pig until one of them works. We want to know before you get a drug when it's going to work, how it's going to work, when do you give it, and how much do you give? And most importantly, is the drug safe? So we hear a lot about the drugs that are out in the market about COVID, and the fact is, the big question, are they really safe? Do they cause kidney problems? Do they cause liver problems? Are they immunosuppressive, like the big dexamethasone that we've heard over the last few days, which is basically a steroid that completely immunosuppresses individuals who are already immunosuppressed. Well, I'll digress back to COVID and the whole COVID story right now. When we first looked at COVID, it was very interesting because we saw patients who looked very much like AIDS patients. AIDS patients have low, quote, CD4 lymphocytes, which is part of the immune system against viruses, right? The other cell that's involved in the immune system against viruses is called a CD8 T cell. Whereas AIDS has low CD4 counts, COVID has very low CD8 counts. But at the end of the day, they create the same situation. That is immunosuppression. So what do we see in COVID patients? Well, it's very interesting, and I'll skip forward a couple of slides. We now know that COVID goes in about 2 different phases. There's an initial phase, which we call the virologic phase. You're infected, you have a positive COVID test, maybe you feel okay, but the virus is in your body and it's replicating. Maybe it progresses, maybe it doesn't. That's one of the biggest questions. And I would say that one of the biggest concerns about COVID is that it's unpredictable. You know, this is my 4th pandemic. I started my career in HIV, which developed a lot of the tools that we're using today in COVID. And then I was a head of virology at Stanford during SARS-1 and the H1N1 flu in the late 2000s. And there are very similar themes in all of these pandemics. However, COVID is one that has been highly, highly unpredictable. It starts out as a viral disease, but at some tipping point, which you see in the middle of this slide, it goes from being a virologic disease to an immunologic disease. And it's the immunologic disease in its severest form that causes the damage of the lungs, the damage to the kidneys, the damage to the liver, the coagulation that you see with strokes, amputations that we're seeing recently. And even in kids, a disease that's similar to what's called Kawasaki's disease, which is basically extreme inflammation of blood vessels, including the coronary arteries, that can cause death in some of these kids. As I'm saying this, you can see how unpredictable and unusual this viral infection is in terms of all the different manifestations that it causes. Well, what is this switch in the middle of this slide that causes COVID to go from a virologic disease to an immunologic disease? Now, that was a big question 2.5 months ago when I was working with my Chinese colleagues in trying to figure out what was happening. We were in the middle of developing some tests for them. We looked at what was called cytokines. Cytokines are proteins that are made by immune cells and other cells to basically confer function on your body's immune system for the most part. And cytokines are involved in moving cells around your body to fight off these different pathogens no matter where they are. So it's a very interesting set of proteins that get released into the circulation. And we found very high levels of this one protein called RANTES, or CCL5, in all of these patients across the board in COVID infection. Why is that important? Well, RANTES is like a magnet. When RANTES is produced, it pulls immune cells from all over your body into these areas of inflammation, right? Now that's fine, that's what it's supposed to do, except when it's overactive. And unlike some of the other proteins that make up what's called the cytokine storm, which is what everybody's hearing about on CNN and other shows, which is just this mass release of these proteins that are supposed to confer immune functions, but it's overzealous. It's hyperimmunity, and it's actually causing lung damage and kidney damage and liver damage and coagulation. That's a problem. But it's all being driven by the fact that this one protein, RANTES, is pulling in the cells that make these proteins that make up the cytokine storm. So what does that mean for us in terms of therapies and for vaccines for that matter? Well, the fact is, with emerging infections, we don't have any tools, any drugs, any vaccines that are specific for the emerging pathogen. And that's a big shortcoming in terms of the world and how we prepare for the next pandemic. We need to have a stockpile of drugs that have a general, broad application against pathogens that we may not even know about, because it's going to take 12 to 18 months to come up with pathogen-specific therapies or vaccines for that matter. And so, what can we do about that? Well, what we've learned in cancer over the past 5 years is the most powerful drug against cancer is our own immune system. We found drugs like Opdivo and Keytruda and some of these others that bring back the immune response against tumors, okay? There was a case when I was working with a large pharmaceutical company where there was a melanoma the size of a golf ball. They took 12 months of one of these, quote, immuno-oncology drugs that restored the immune response. And by the end of 12 months, it was the size of a freckle, and you could scrape it off with a scalpel blade. Now, my original thinking back 2.5 months ago when we had this emerging infection is, let's manipulate the immune response like we're manipulating the immune response in cancer. Let's do that to this virus and see what happens. And in fact, when we found this rantes, there was a great drug called leronlimab that actually blocks the binding of this rantes to immune cells and actually prevents this mass migration of cells non-specifically into the lung and other organs, and relieves and quiets this storm of bad proteins that are causing all the immune damage in these patients. And in addition, it restored the immunosuppression. So these patients were horribly immunosuppressed. They took the drug and their levels of their lymphocytes, their CD8 cells, went back to normal. Then, surprisingly, unlike this drug remdesivir, which was just approved, which is an antiviral, this drug leronlimab actually dropped the amount of virus. It shut off the viral replication, and by 14 days, the viral burden was 0. Okay? Now, the biggest question when this remdesivir got approved was, why is this antiviral not shutting off virus? And that's what led me to be skeptical about that as a therapy. Because the 3 things you need in COVID are A, quiet this so-called cytokine storm to prevent all the lung damage and organ damage. B, restore the immune response because these patients are immunosuppressed and could die of bacterial infections or other viral infections. And C, stop the virus. Now, the government, Fauci, and others have proposed, well, that may take 2 drugs. Well, what's fascinating about our study that we just published in the preprint journal was that this drug leronlimab did all 3 of those. It quieted the cytokine storm, it restored immunosuppression, and it dropped the virus. What more than you need in COVID? So the goal for COVID therapy is really to address these phases of disease. And like I said, it's very, very unpredictable. We don't know which patients are going from this virologic phase to the immunologic phase. There's not a marker, although we think rantes may be that marker, the protein that we discovered at IncelDX. And the fact is, this drug leronlimab in early phases may prevent the transition from virologic or mild disease to severe disease. And in late disease, would reverse all of these changes in immunosuppression that I just mentioned. And the fact that I'm smiling, or at least glowing a little bit, is the fact that this drug has saved lives. At the end of the day, we have already saved lives. Would we love to save more? Absolutely. We're in the middle of 2 big FDA clinical trials, one for mild to moderate disease, one for severe disease. And if it turns out how we expect, and again, we've seen data on hundreds of patients over multiple weeks of therapy, we're hopeful and we're excited about the possibility that this drug can keep patients from going from mild disease to severe disease, and in the severest of diseases, save lives. And that is the goal of all COVID therapy. And that is a therapeutic. Now, everyone's talking about the vaccines and how quickly they're coming out. Big lesson from HIV. Okay, we used to hear reports about successful trials of vaccines. Yeah, phase 1, they were safe. You could give the vaccine and they wouldn't get HIV, right? So the 2 biggest hurdles in vaccine are, does it make antibodies that help fight off infection, and are those antibodies effective? Those are the 2 big hurdles that remain for vaccines. This virus mutates and has high sequence variability around the world. So, you know, it's not quite as mutating as HIV, but, you know, that gives me pause as well about the ultimate efficacy of vaccines. But I'm very hopeful that we have therapeutics. And if we have therapeutics that prevent death and therapeutics that prevent morbidity, we can get back to work. This becomes just another viral infection like the influenza or other respiratory viruses that we get in the winter, because it's something that we can deal with and we can prevent the death. The problem was in COVID, which is also worrisome with the relaxation of all these shelter in place. And of course, we've seen a massive increase in cases due to that. My concern is people talk about infection rates and they talk about death rates. And they say the death rate is relatively low relative to Ebola and maybe some other viruses. However, nobody talks about the morbidity in this disease. This is not about do I live or do I die, in the people who die, a relatively small percentage. The problem is these people who get infected and who have severe infection are not better. If you look at this graph, it goes out to 30 days. 30 days after infection, some people have not gotten back to normal. When we get the flu, we get other respiratory viruses in the winter, we stay in bed for a week, we get our strength back a little, we go back to work the next week, we're still a little weak, maybe a little tired, but at the end of 2 weeks, you're back in the gym and you're feeling fine. That is not the case in COVID, and we're not talking about it. These people are 30 days out, 40 days out. Their cytokines, all their blood work that I've been working with in hundreds and hundreds of patients over time, 30 days, 40 days, it's not normal. It's not back to normal. And all this inflammation is making them not feel well. And there is the possibility that this inflammation is doing damage. Rantes, this protein that we discovered that I'm talking about, has been implicated in renal failure, has been implicated in liver toxicity, has been implicated in coagulopathies or coagulation, which is strokes and clots and all the things you're hearing about, these people who have to have amputations. It's all being driven by massive, massive amounts of inflammation. And the hope is drugs like leronlimab will be able to treat that. But we have to treat that for a long period of time, potentially. And Rantes is a marker to tell us, when do you start treating? Because when do you make that switch from a viral disease to an immunologic disease? And how long do you treat? But that's what our ability is in medicine right now, is to give a drug and know what it's doing. We no longer use patients as guinea pigs, and let's give this a try, and let's give that a try. We know when to start a therapy. We know when to stop a therapy. And ultimately, that not only saves the patient pain and suffering, but also saves healthcare dollars. And I think some of the other talks today are going to be the healthcare and the economic implications of COVID, which we also have to take into account as we're moving forward with some of these approaches. But again, I'm very hopeful, and I'm hopeful that we have a drug, that we have a therapy that will remove the specter of death, remove the specter of horrible morbidities, and makes this just another infection. And we can go about our business, get back to work, and get this economy restored. Thank you. I really appreciate the TEDx folks for inviting me. It's been very exciting to do this in my home country up here in northern Michigan. And be safe, be well. We're working on it. Thank you very much.